these charges against Donald Trump or former President Trump certainly look very, very politically motivated.
Okay, well, welcome to the inaugural episode of Beneath the Law. And where that came from is you've heard a lot of talk of late in a lot of high-profile cases where people have been quite righteously and sanctimoniously saying that no one is above the law. And that means that if no one is above the law, everyone is beneath it. And that was the reason for our thought to put this podcast together, to sort of go beneath what are the headlines and hashtags in our world today and understanding really what's going on in law and politics and the intersection of law and politics, and hopefully have a little bit of fun and make this a little interesting. Introducing my co-host, Stephen Thiele, and partner of many, many years, and co-combatant in a number of files over the years. Stephen, hello.
Hello, Gavin. How are you doing? And happy that we're putting this podcast together for sure. A lot of people read what's in the media and they get impressions about cases through the filter of media sources. And, people really need to understand that there's a lot more to what they read in the media. And, this podcast is really about digging underneath the surface and getting deep into some of the legal issues and provide a better understanding with respect to what people read in the media or what they hear. So exactly. I'm excited about doing this.
Yeah, me too. And I think one of the key things that we've seen lately is the use of the legal process as part of the political arena and the use of law in politics. Now, there's no doubt that there is a clear connection between law and politics. The purpose of politicians is to pass law. So politicians create law. The problem, I think, arises sometimes when law is used as a political weapon to achieve political results. And we talked about doing this podcast, and lo and behold, as our friends south of the border are so helpful, they've served us up on a platter, probably one of the most salacious law and politics topics that I can ever recall, which is, of course, features none other than the world's most famous man, Donald Trump. And we've all seen in the media the great spectacle and hullabaloo that occurred in New York City recently with the former president being charged, arraigned, and indicted, etc. And that really raises a number of issues for law and politics. And of course, your views on that will very much align with your views on Trump and the Republicans, etc., and your views on the Democratic prosecutor that is bringing these charges. And to my mind, that is unfortunate. So what we're going to try to do is to depoliticize what is a inherently political case and talk about some of the facts that are going on here and some of the legal processes underlying it, which the headlines kind of gloss over or give a spin on that may not be accurate. First of all, one of the things that's been thrown around a lot, and it's a little unfamiliar to those of us in Canada, is the entire U.S. process that led up to these charges. And this may be our first episode, but it's probably our last episode that we're going to be focusing on American jurisprudence and American procedure, although I'm sure we'll get into it again at some other time. But first of all, there's a lot of words that are thrown around in the headlines that I frankly doubt very much that many Canadians, including a lot of Canadian lawyers, really have any real understanding of. So there's words such as
sure, and
grand juries, indictments, you name it. What the heck are those things? So Stephen, maybe we can talk about that.
And from a comparative standpoint, in Canada, what happens in the U.S. is completely foreign to us. Right?
And,
they use
and a lot
grand
of other
juries. What is a grand jury? To me, the grand jury, after looking at the process, is not so grand, is it?
It sounds like the Grand Inquisitor. A grand jury is a great headline, grabber, because it does sound very official. It does sound as if there is some substance to an indictment granted by a grand jury. And indeed, I think that comes out of an old tradition, British tradition of grand juries, which I think goes back to like the 1700s. And where there was this sense that, look, prosecutors have a lot of power. There is a great impact in being charged with something. Forget about being convicted. So when you wield power, I think in any responsible society, they want to ensure that you do so responsibly and not in a way that is to achieve collateral purposes. So the grand jury, I think, where it found its origins was to say, look, we're going to impanel a group of citizens who ultimately will decide whether there's enough there to bother even going forward to the charging level of a criminal type process. Forget about convicting. So the grand jury started off, I think, in a fairly legitimate purpose. But one of the things that we've discovered is, of course, grand juries are not only foreign to Canada; they're foreign to pretty much everywhere. The only place in the world that still has a grand jury system other than the United States is Liberia.
Yeah, for sure.
In Africa. So the grand jury is basically a group of citizens, and they're empowered by the federal or state law to conduct legal proceedings, and they're supposed to investigate potential criminal conduct and determine whether criminal charges should be brought. As I mentioned, it originated in England, but it's only used now in the United States. It is very much, though, to my mind, a star chamber type process. There's nobody there except the prosecutor. The grand jury is completely in the hands of the prosecutor. And I think there was one New York State decision where a judge in New York said that the prosecutor could indict a ham sandwich in front of a grand jury because basically they just are doing the bidding of the prosecutor in laying the charges. Stephen, what are your views on that?
Well, it sounds to me after looking at this that that's very much what a grand jury is. It's a rubber stamp. The prosecutor presents their evidence the way that they want to present their evidence. No judge is present. The lawyers for the defendant or the accused are not present. And really there's also no vetting of the people who sit on the grand jury and vetting them for bias. So it really is a process. It's a secretive process. We talk about the comment made by a New York judge about, the grand jury indicting a ham sandwich, and I'm just wondering if the prosecutor is feeding Trump as a ham sandwich to the media and to the public.
Best served raw. The reality of that is that was converted, and it has been converted in a lot of media processes to suggest that the grand jury process actually is some indication of merit in the charges. And I think, in fairness, that's not the case. I think that anyone who takes any comfort from the fact, well, a grand jury thought that there was something to this, I think that comfort would be misplaced, and therefore the grand jury indictment really is meaningless. And one wonders how long the grand jury system in the U.S. will continue, given that it really has lost its purpose, which was to act as some sort of check and balance with respect to prosecutorial power. And in that regard, in Canada, for example, there is no such thing as a grand jury. Crown attorneys can prosecute or charge people as they see fit, and police do it all the time. There is no need for this type of process to seek a grand jury indictment. And I think that's important in the process of what we're talking about here, because basically what the charges against Trump relate to are, and I think they even talk about this, are bookkeeping frauds. They are pretty small white-collar type crimes that the allegations relate to. And those, Stephen, are usually referred to in the U.S. as misdemeanors, which are, as the name suggests, lesser charges. For some reason, the the former president is being charged not with misdemeanors, but with felonies, which in the U.S. are the more serious charges. Maybe we could talk a bit about what that difference is and why has the prosecutor decided to proceed with felonies instead of misdemeanors?
Well, it's, we'll, I guess, discuss a little bit later on here about the entire politicization of this process, right? The grand jury is a very political process in and of itself. It looks good for the media. It's certainly attractive, I guess, from a democracy point of view that the United States still holds on to. But looking at the charges, my understanding in the U.S., we don't have, again, this kind of distinction between misdemeanor and felony. Those words don't exist in our criminal code. And so a misdemeanor, as you say, is a lesser charge, which usually doesn't carry a sentence beyond 1 year, which, a minor bookkeeping kind of an offense would carry. And in some cases, there are different categories of misdemeanors in the United States as well, that in some cases it might just result in a fine or, a 3-month sentence. So it's been elevated to a felony. And again, there are different categories of felonies. There are more serious felonies and less serious felonies. Major assaults or sexual assaults, those kinds of things are felony offenses. And, when you compare the two and you look at the charges, it really looks like what we've got here, and Trump has said this as well, is that all of these charges are very political in nature. And is there really any legitimacy to these charges? I mean, I don't know, Gavin, if you want to get a little bit into what we understand with respect to these charges, but some of them are bookkeeping offenses. Some of them relate to the National Enquirer having paid money to a couple of other people and then have gone to Donald Trump's, I guess, his campaign team while he was running for president to say, hey, by the way, we paid $150,000 to somebody, and we want to be compensated for that because we killed the story, and a check seems to have been written to pay National Enquirer. And like I don't understand. I don't think we've really seen the detail of the charges because, again, they're kind of secret.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm really getting, first of all, I think the issue on whether a felony or misdemeanor might be quite mundane from the purposes of this prosecutor, because my understanding of the New York limitation issue, and this is important in terms of limitation periods matter in all litigation, including criminal litigation, and no matter whether there's merit in something or not merit in something, if you've missed the limitation period, you're out of court. And my understanding is there's a different limitation period for a felony and a misdemeanor, and all of these, of course, charges relate to conduct that occurred prior to the 2016 election. So the time for a misdemeanor prosecution is over. The time, as I understand, the time for a misdemeanor prosecution is 2 years, and the time for a felony prosecution is 5. So in order for this prosecution to go ahead at all, it has to be a felony. That raises the bar quite a bit for the prosecutor. It's a more difficult claim to make on a felony, and that makes sense. The more serious the charge, the more difficult it should be to prove. But the issue here, from my perspective, is this, as you mentioned, politicization of this. And the timing is not only important from a legal perspective, but obviously important from a political perspective, because Trump has obviously announced his candidacy again for the Republican nomination. As I understand matters, he was leading before. Talk about politicization. This has polarized things even further. In some ways, the prosecution is probably helping Trump because, as I understand it, his numbers have gone through the roof, frankly, if you quote him, since the prosecution started, because it has polarized views so much. But it's put the from a legal perspective, it's put the prosecutor, Mr. Alan Bragg, who, as you mentioned, is an elected official who, in fact, ran on a platform that he was going to get Trump. Took him a while, but here he is. And he now must, quite frankly, prove a felony. I think he's out of time on a misdemeanor. So what he's done, and I think one of the legal analysts in the U.S. has referred to it as a bank shot prosecution, which is laddering up a series of smaller offenses to try to create a larger felony prosecution. And that's really the issue here. The charge here is felony bookkeeping fraud. And there are 34 particulars of that set out, and you mentioned a couple of them. That's usually a misdemeanor, but can be a felony if defendant intended to commit, aid, or conceal a crime. So if there was an underlying crime that the fraudulent bookkeeping was designed to paste up or cover up, fraud would be the obvious example of that, where you're trying to fix up your books to show that a fraud was not actually occurring. But it relies for its existence as a felony on an underlying crime. And when you review the indictment, I don't know that underlying crime is set out in the indictment.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that at all. And if we compare this to litigation, civil litigation, part of this is about settling claims or potential claim that someone would have had against Donald Trump. And, claims are settled all the time. And some are settled inside courts, some are settled outside of court. Somebody makes an accusation. I mean, we see this all the time with celebrities. Somebody makes a claim that they've done something wrong, that there's some kind of impropriety. They threaten to sue, and to, avoid a lawsuit, somebody decides, okay, I'm just going to cut a check. And from that perspective, these charges don't make a heck of a lot of sense. Because it's also tied to the politics that somehow, he improved his position in running for president by agreeing to pay the National Enquirer. And I'm not sure that that really holds water.
Yeah, I think there are 34 particulars in this indictment. In a really general way, let's just talk about what they are. I mean, that's why we talk about the intersection of law and politics. And could there be a more salacious story underlying this than the one that involving Trump? What we have here is an allegation by a former porn star, Stormy Daniels, who claims that she had a one-night stand with Trump. Whether that's true or not, doesn't really matter. Then there was a payment made to her by Trump's former attorney, Mr. Cohen. That payment was purportedly for an NDA, which is a non-disclosure agreement. And as Stephen, as you mentioned, those are pretty run-of-the-mill in lawsuits. Confidentiality clauses or agreements are pretty run-of-the-mill. I will say that as far as non-disclosure agreements go, this one is got to be the worst example of value for money ever. Because if you were trying to buy a quiet hush money story, boy, did you ever not get what you paid for. And look, I think that the fact that there's an NDA, a lot of people will say, see, nobody would pay for someone to keep quiet unless they were guilty. I think in fairness, there's lots of reasons why people just want stuff to go away. They don't want to deal with it. And, confidentiality clauses, quite frankly, are very commonplace in most releases that accompany the settlement of most civil claims. And they are also generally accompanied by a clear statement that there's no admission of liability, no admission of guilt, no admission of anything. But this is basically the price of peace. And part of the peace is not only that the litigation will go away, in the usual course, but usually that the whole thing will go away and I won't have to worry about it anymore. So,
and the price of peace in this case, as I understand it, is part of the monies were paid from Donald Trump's personal bank accounts, and the allegation is that part of the monies were paid through a corporate account or a shell company that was set up specifically for the purpose of making a payment. So I'm not sure where the bookkeeping error comes in. I guess it's was classified as being a legal expense under the corporate under the company, but it doesn't matter who pays the money in a settlement. I can direct somebody else to pay the money, or if somebody else comes along and wants to pay the settlement, great.
Yeah, that's really where in his comments, I mean, as I said, the underlying crime that the bookkeeping fraud is alleged to have pasted up, for lack of a better word, is not disclosed in the indictment at the moment. There's no doubt that if this case proceeds, I don't know how the prosecutor backs out of it at this point from a political perspective. We'll get to that in a minute. But the underlying crime will have to be disclosed at some point. And in press conferences, the district attorney, Mr. Bragg, indicated that exactly was the point that he was suggesting was the other crime, because he's saying that the categorization of the $150,000 payment, which went from Trump and or a company controlled by Trump to a lawyer, Cohen, and then off to the porn star, and was booked by the company as legal expenses. Mr. Bragg suggests, well, the only reason for doing that was because you planned on cheating on your taxes, and you were going to claim it as a deduction, because legal expenses would be a deduction theoretically, and rather than a payment that would not be deductible for hush money for your one-night stand, which would have been a personal expense anyways. So he's suggesting that the crime that was covered up was not a past crime, but a future contemplated crime of tax evasion. Because as far as I know, there is no suggestion, or there is no allegation at this point, that the felony bookkeeping paste up of the expense was actually fraudulently or reported for taxes, for New York state taxes, which is, of course, also part of the problem that Mr. Bragg has, is he's kind of confined in his jurisdiction, that he can only deal with New York state law. And of course, Trump was running in a federal election, which would be governed by federal law. And I don't know that, I don't believe that D.A. Bragg has any jurisdiction to prosecute a federal offense.
You talked about, I guess somebody commented, it's like a bank shot. This sounds to me more like it's a bunch of dots that need to be connected in order to get to the end goal of a prosecution, and there are a lot of dots to connect.
Yeah, and the other two, if you take the broad categories of criminal offense that are referred to in the indictment, the other two I think are even further removed, in fairness, just because the payments didn't originate with Trump. They originated with a purported Trump supporter, the National Enquirer, and its owner, who is apparently a buddy of Trump's and Trump had at the White House, etc., who paid a former Playboy bunny to $150,000 for the exclusive rights to her story of her affair with Trump. One thing is coming out of this is Trump certainly gets around. Or is alleged to get around. We don't want to be on the receiving end of any litigation ourselves. And then another payment by Trump's buddies at the National Enquirer to the doorman at his, I guess it was his apartment in New York City, who had some story about a child that Trump allegedly fathered in the 1980s. And the National Enquirer, that it wasn't hush money per se, was that the National Enquirer claims that it bought the exclusive rights to these stories. In other words, that these people, in exchange for the funds, couldn't tell their story. Again, the National Enquirer didn't seem to get what they paid for, because now everybody's heard the story. So those are the other two payments that are alleged in a similar fashion to be bookkeeping frauds. But again, of course, these are payments by the National Enquirer, and I think what the allegation is, oh yeah, but you paid them back later for the money they expended to buy out the stories. That seems even further removed than the Stormy Daniels, Michael Cohen allegations.
No, and you look, I mean, with respect to the doorman, if it was the 1980s, I'm not sure when he was paid out. But it certainly, I guess, raises that limitation period that you were talking about. I guess quickly, if we can, maybe we should look at the complete politics of this, because we know that the Manhattan District Attorney Bragg, who's prosecuting this, so he was first elected in something like 2020. He wasn't around in 2016 as the District Attorney of Manhattan, capable of laying these charges. He's a Democrat. Right, district attorneys in the United States run in elections, so that's a political process. Looking at Mr. Bragg's background, I mean, he's a law professor and he's been a prosecuting attorney for a long time. So, one would think at face value, taken at face value, that the charges that he's bringing, or allegations that are in these charges, are legitimate. But he seems to get into a lot of disputes with Republican lawmakers with respect to subpoenas. And so there's a real political tension that he seems to have with people on the opposite side of the political spectrum. And so these charges against Donald Trump, or former President Trump, certainly look very, very politically motivated.
I agree, and I think that it's unfortunate in a couple of ways. First of all, from both a political perspective and from a legal perspective. First of all, I think that one of the things that can be said about the Canadian system, and I'm not here to suggest that the Canadian system is superior or not, but in this way, in my view, it is. I mean, I think that people expect that the administration of justice will be truly undertaken in a way that is without favor or prejudice against anyone in particular, and will be undertaken in a way that is not only independent, but seen to be independent. I mean, there's a reason why that famous statue of justice has a blindfold on. You're not supposed to pick your targets as a prosecutor. And frankly, that's probably what the grand jury system back in England was designed to avoid in the first place. So that, I think, what that does, to my mind, is it generally lowers the view of the justice system in the eyes of the average person. What they see it as is a targeted prosecution for political reasons. And that cannot be a good thing. No matter which side of the political spectrum you're on, justice should be blind. And justice should be administered in a way that is blind. And I think that when you've got this creative prosecution that's going on, people see it as such. I mean, I think that they see it as such regardless of that. And then my second point was from a political perspective. Wow, you're going to do this? You're going to charge the former president? And I know that he's got other charges pending against him in other places, but you better be right, because if this prosecution fails, it will boomerang, I think, against the party that is bringing it, and will only help to increase Trump's popularity, certainly among his base. But I think that's a real risk, and I think it was a political gamble, and it is a political gamble that may blow up.
Yeah, so certainly from a political perspective, look, this seems to be the state of the game these days. There's a lot of animosity on both sides of the fence, and one side is out to get the other side as much as possible. The professionalism in politics certainly has disappeared. But you raise a very interesting comment about the politicization, and there shouldn't be any interference. And when you kind of harken back a few years ago to Jody Wilson-Raybould resigning from cabinet, it was all about political interference with respect to charges against SNC Lavalin, and how we reacted as Canadians to that, and how she reacted, that she viewed that she had to resign because of what she alleged was blatant political interference in a prosecution. And in the United States, it seems to be that that's fair game. That's how the system works.
Yeah, but I do think that, speaking up on that point of Jody Wilson-Raybould's resignation and the principal basis for that, and I think that most Canadians, that resonated with a great number of Canadians, because I think that no matter which side of the political spectrum you're on, we would hope that the administration of justice would be administered impartially and fairly, and not targeted in the sense that you don't target your enemies and help your friends. And on the Jody Wilson-Raybould side of things, it was a nudge or a hint. I think was her story was that she was directed to lay off on a potential defendant who was seen as a friendly participant on that political side. I think when law gets too political, what happens? I think people lose confidence in the law. And if people lose confidence in the law, let's not kid ourselves. The law and the administration of justice is one of the bedrocks of democracy. And that really starts to erode, if I can say that, public confidence in not only that fundamental institution, but in the entire democratic process.
It's a big turnoff. A lot of good people stay away from politics because of these kinds of issues. It'll all make, I guess, for great TV in the United States, and will probably be glued to the television if this is broadcasted to follow all the testimony with respect to these charges. But, at the end of the day, it seems to have already backfired in terms of, rather than hurting Trump's popularity, it seems to have increased his popularity. And in the United States, we seem to be in election mode all the time.
No question about that. But I've just got to scratch my head because it just seems so predictable. It just seems so predictable to me that when political actors seek to use the justice system for political ends, people see through it pretty quickly, and it is so obvious. And the backlash against that from the public, as I say, seems to me to be so predictable. So I'm kind of surprised that the people, whoever may be, that Mr. Bragg, who is clearly a political actor, he is a politician. His day job is district attorney, but he's looking at re-election. He's in a very democratic city. As a Democrat, he will inevitably be re-elected should he run, or even potentially run for higher office.
Well, he won by a landslide. He got over 85% of the vote.
Well, I think depending on where you are in the U.S., if you get the right party affiliation, you might elect a ham sandwich as well as indictment. So I think that that was a strange political calculus. It seems to have been, for people that are vowed Trump haters, I'm sure this was a popular decision. But I don't think that anyone, even no matter how much you hate Trump, would want to see him get charged and have those charges thrown out.
It also, Gavin, it seems to deflect away from, what would have been, in my view, certainly a much more serious kind of crime. The insurrection riots that took place on January 6th, I guess the date was, in Washington, following the election. That seems to, that would carry, in my view, greater legitimacy in terms of an investigation whether a crime was committed. And now we see these other charges, and it waters down now everything that Trump is purported to have allegedly done with respect to inciting people to riot in Washington. And, if looking at it as a casual observer in some respects, because we're not American, it doesn't really impact us in terms of who's president per se, or the politics. I mean, we've got our own politicians that we criticize and do things that impact us. But I'd be growing tired of this.
I think people most certainly are growing quite tired of it. But let me say this: the background, the rebound, the boomerang effect that this is going to have. Let's go back to how did Trump incite that riot? How did Trump's entire theme has been the establishment is out to get you, Joe Everyman. Don't have faith in the institutions of our democracy. Don't have faith in the election process. Don't have faith in all of these various institutions because it's a fix. The fix is in. They're out to get you. I am your savior. Look, they're every time they go after me, they're really going after you. And now what do we have? Now what we have, quite frankly, in my view, is you've got a district attorney playing into that hand completely. Look what they're doing to me. Look what a victim I am. They're chasing me on these trumped up, for lack of a better word, charges that they've literally gone to the metaphysical school of law to figure out how to create something in a state jurisdiction that would be time barred usually, so that they can somehow get me. And if they're prepared to go to those lengths to subvert the system of justice, look, that completely plays into his narrative. So I come back to the point, when you're going to use the political dynamite of litigation, you better be careful, because, if you're not careful with dynamite, you can blow your arm off. Great tool to have if you're building, railways and whatnot, but be real careful when you're handling it.
I agree 100% with all those views. And like I said, earlier, we'll be glued to the TV for sure when these charges go forward. And it's always fascinating watching U.S. politics. And as you said, Trump was down at something like 40%. And I think after these charges were laid, he jumped up, 5 to 10 points. And we're coming into another election cycle. People are lining up to be the Republican candidate. And for Donald Trump, this is great news for him.
I agree. Well, that ends our first episode of Beneath the Law, and I wanted to thank everybody for taking the time to listen. I hope it was enjoyable, entertaining, and maybe slightly informative. Always a great pleasure to chat with my buddy Stephen Thiele, and we do this regularly around the office, pretty much probably more than we should, and it's great to be able to do it with all of you people as well. Please leave us a rating. We're newbies at this, rookies. We're trying to find our way, and if you tell us we could do things better, we're certainly going to try to do it. I know we can do things better, and we'll keep trying to do that. Also, if you found this in the slightest bit entertaining, please forward off to a friend or two, as we'd like to get this podcast out and rolling. And as we always say, if nobody is above the law, then everyone is beneath it. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Beneath the Law, and we hope to see you again.